So in practice, what the blogs do for us, how do we actually use them on the course? Well, for me, they're really about mapping the learning journey. They're really about marking the staging post, as it were, of the process that they go through over the course of the 2 years that they're with us as postgraduate students, and really in quite fine detail, marking out that kind of territory, as it were, marking out landmarks on that forward movement that they're taking. But they're also really about personal expression. It's a very important thing that every blog is unique, it's original, it's an individual person's point of view, and that goes beyond personal expression. I think blogs give you this fantastic, what I call, whole person view, because typically they're not just writing about the narrow range of their professional practice, they're also writing about other influences they have, movies they've seen, music they've listened to, films they've watched, books they've read, poetry they read. It really gives this sense of all the other things that are going on in their creative lives, as well as the actual sort of narrow range of assignments they're being given for their college work. It's also all these other things that go around to make up, as I said, what we call this whole person view. And obviously, because they're in real time, and that's a really important thing, that you can react to them very quickly. You can get in there, you can get information out of them. You can do things with them very rapidly, and they're a great sort of feedback response loop kind of thing, where a student can post a question, get real-time feedback on that from the peer group or from the staff. They're obviously also really about dialogue, and that's about dialogue itself. It's very important that dialogue takes place internally, but that's expressed through the vehicle of the blog, but also obviously about dialogue with an audience. And that idea of beginning to learn of how to interact with an audience, using the blog as a way of understanding how you might relate to other people, particularly in this kind of online world. I mean, a lot of photographers nowadays, their main vehicle of dissemination is the web. They're putting their pictures out online, showcasing them to an audience, bypassing traditional sort of media. So that sense of learning how to find an audience, how to relate to an audience, how to discuss things with an audience is obviously very important about a blog in terms of the learning journey. And obviously they're about peer group feedback. They're about getting the opinions of your colleagues and your friends and your co-students, your co-workers on what you're doing. The other really powerful thing about them, which really marks them out, I think, as being different to the traditional learning journal, is simply the amount of stuff that you can pack into them. They're rich media. They're full of you can put images in there, you can put video, you can put links in, you can put sound in, which obviously for a media course is really important. You can really cram a lot of interesting stuff in there, far more than you could with a traditional kind of paper-based learning journal. And then, of course, once you've got all that stuff in there, you can do stuff with it. You can mix it up. You can mash it up. You can make links. If you tag things, you can then search it. You can reslice this archive. You can recompose it. You can recontextualize it. You can mix it up. You can do whatever you want with it. And, of course, the tutors can do that as well. So the tutors can follow through a train of thought along a particular series of themes. And, by using tags cleverly, you can have different kinds of assignment work going on within a student's blog simultaneously, but then you can actually find it. So you can, example, ask them to tag a particular project with a particular name, which means that if you want to see the tags just on that particular project, you can just very quickly search it and look through. So that's a very, very powerful way in which I think they really move on reflective practice from the more traditional sort of paper-based journals. The other great thing about them as well is obviously they're portable and they're easy to get access to, and that's for the whole group. So I, as a tutor, can get into their blogs 24/7 if I want to check them in the middle of the night or on a weekend or whenever that happens to fit my time schedule. I can get in there, so can they, so can the other group within the peer, or so can their peer group, as it were. But also, I think this is a really key thing about them for me. I found them to be incredibly emotional. They're really about the real hopes and fears and successes and failures of the participants. And that, to me, is a really authentic, powerful thing that blogs give me. And they're also quite playful very often. They're quite sort of, humorous. They're quite funny. They're quite sort of light sometimes. They're not formal. They're not academic writing. They're sort of a bit more informal than that. That's very important, I think, in terms of their character. But to me, what they're really about is this idea of what this idea of connected knowledge, this idea of Brockbank and McGill's, that connected knowledge is about an empathetic relationship between the different participants in a learning experience, between the collaborators in a learning experience, and about really bringing people into a space space where they really understand what the other person's about. They really get under the skin, as it were, of what the person's doing. And to me, blogs have given me insights into the typical student far, far in excess of anything I get in conventional face-to-face tutorial sessions. Half-hour tutorial sessions, almost everything is based around the piece of work that they've done. You don't really have time to talk about all the other things that are going on in somebody's life, nor do you really have time to talk about the minutiae of the process by which they arrived at the project that they're doing. You're normally just talking about the product rather than the process. And I think what the blogs have given me as an educator is a fantastic, deep insight really into how learners learn, because it really unpicks the nuts and bolts, the actual sort of, the journey, the step-by-step process by which the student resolves a problem in a really, really detailed, really, really fine-grained, kind of thick description. It's a really thick description of what's going on in that process. So for me, it's really helped me understand that. And there's an example here from one of our blogs about how that process comes through. This is, we asked them to talk about what they've done on their assignments. And this is a girl who was photographing an assignment about photographing relationships between people. She was photographing a group of people playing cards. And you can see how she's worked through, she describes here how she works through that assignment. The formal aspects of the situation, how to frame the picture, how to make it more interesting, how it didn't work, how she should have tried a different lens, and so on and so forth. So you're getting a really nice, nuanced, detailed view of what's going on in the learning experience in that sort of assignment that you've set. And this is very much sort of going with Steve Eskow's idea of e-learning, this idea of experiential learning and e-learning together, the synergies between them becoming much more powerful and really creating something greater than the sum of the parts. This idea of leveraging experience, amplifying the experience, as I said, by using e-learning technologies to really bring those two things together into what he calls this idea of the scholar practitioner, very much echoing, obviously, again, Schoen's ideas. So for me, it's really about articulating experience into learning. It's about how do you translate your real-world experience into understanding, knowledge, and an idea of what to do in the future. So, obviously, I think the blog sits really nicely within the sort of traditional, e-learning, learning cycle, the kind of Kolbian learning cycle. And in a way, it's a little bit like sort of the central spokes of a wheel, and you have your process, of movement going around in your circle from experience, working with that experience, reflecting on it, coming with some sort of new ideas, testing those out in the field, and then sort of adding them to your repertoire. But I think, obviously there's the critique of the traditional cycle is it's linear. It has this sense of, even if you stop at different points in that cycle, it's still a kind of circular, rather flat process. So I've been thinking a bit more, and I'd be very interested to see what people think about these different ways of thinking it through. I think that the blogging and sort of Web 2 technology open that process up much more, making it a much more kind of web-like, network-like, interconnected sort of experience where things aren't just happening in a linear, circular fashion, they're happening in all these other different sorts of ways, and the links are beginning to form in a variety of different ways that link across and back and forth and so on and so forth. But even that to me is still quite flat. It's still quite kind of two-dimensional. So I've been thinking a little bit recently about whether actually within e-learning you've got what I call the Eflective Learning Cloud, a much more three-dimensional, much softer, much more kind of fluid space where there's a lot more overlap between things. And it's in those areas of overlap that the actual interesting things begin to happen. I mean, certainly I think about myself, the way I think I come up with my kind of eureka moments is it's very often coming in from left field. It's not a process of me thinking through a problem step by step. I'm sort of thinking through a problem that way, and then suddenly out of nowhere pops in the solution, and the kind of links happen in a much more sort of three-dimensional way, I think. So that's very much the way that I think the blog absolutely sits in the middle of this e-learning experience. It acts as I said earlier, it acts as the glue, as the kind of central hub, as it were, off which everything else, I think absolutely as Harold says there, the blog is this sort of central, processor, as it were, the kind of core processor of this learning cloud, as it were, that hangs off it. So just to come on a little bit in a bit more detail about what we use blogs for on the course. They're really about the process of documenting the research process of being a practitioner, the ideas people have, the practice that they have. And then that also obviously becomes like an online workbook. It replaces the kind of traditional sketchbook, workbook of art and design studies. But what's great about it is it's such a great archive, and it's a real archive of this creative process. And then obviously it then becomes a great way to showcase your work and get feedback on it. We set the blogs up right on the first day of the course. It's one of the first exercises we get the participants to do, and we get them to write about themselves, a kind of letter to myself, letter to my colleagues rather, write about who they are, what they've been doing, what they've been doing. And actually we found it pretty easy to get set up. We haven't really had any problems about this question, Kate. I'll try to roll that in a little bit later on. I don't think so. We found them actually to actually enhance collaboration, I think, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But we essentially asked them to describe and explore the issues that they face in the assignments that we're setting them, and do that in quite a fine-grained way, as I said before. What they've been really good for, actually, from our point of view, is they've been a very honest and open discussion about the course, about the strengths of the course, but also about the failings, about the things where we get things wrong. And because they're in real time, it's a much more valuable form of student feedback than we get from the traditional kind of, fill in your feedback forms at the end of a semester or whatever, because we can actually react to what people are saying much more quickly when we get the feedback from in the blog. We've also found that the kind of comments that the students make in the blogs are much richer and more honest than the sort of feedback we quite often get when it's anonymous. It's a sense of somehow the blog, because it is this informal space, but it's also they know that somebody's actually reading it. It actually enhances the way that they critique the course, both positively and negatively. And they've also been really, really great, obviously, for support outside of traditional timetable hours. We use them very much to help the students, give them feedback, give them advice and guidance when there aren't any formal classes taking place on the course.